September 11th, 2001 was just a normal, boring day. I got to work about half an hour early. I worked in State Farm Insurance at the time. My office manager was already there. The boss hadn't come in yet. My office manager said that she had heard a call from her sister that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. And in my arrogance, I naturally said, well, she had to be wrong. And I thought that she was talking about a mostly forgotten incident in the 1930s when a U.S. Army Air Corps bomber smashed into the Empire State Building. She said no, I was wrong, but I was 34 and arrogant, and I wouldn't listen. Then she got a call from her sister who said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center, and while the news crew was setting up a camera to film the aftermath of the disaster, another plane hit the other one. She said it kind of laughingly, like it was, can you believe those wacky New Yorkers kind of thing? And I didn't take it seriously either. So we went in the back room and turned on the TV, and there was looped footage of the second plane hitting over and over and over again. And I don't remember what I said. I doubt that anything I said would have been insightful or... Well, anyway, so my boss came in and we told him what had happened, but he had already heard it on talk radio. He had a television in his office, which was separate from the rest of the office where we were, and he watched CNN and Fox jumping back and forth between the two. We got one or two customers the normal way, but then they started trickling off as the news got out. My office manager and I took turns in the back room and watching the TV, and would come out every so often with an update as to what had happened. Presently, I just rolled the TV from the break room and back out into the main room where we did our business, plugged it into the side, and we just stood around watching that. Every half hour or so, a customer would come in. They would wordlessly make a payment or whatever changes to their insurance policy they needed to. Sometimes they would just come in and stand by us and watch what was unfolding.
Oh my God, so both towers are down.
I got an aircraft out east of the White House.
We got word that a plane had hit the Pentagon. There wasn't any immediate footage of that available, but that shocked us, and we thought the whole thing was going to just keep going all day long.
United 9-3, have you got information on that yet?
Yeah, he's down.
He's down?
Yes.
When did he land?
He did not land.
Oh, he's down?
Yeah, somewhere up northeast of Camp David.
Later on, we heard that a fourth plane had crashed in Pennsylvania, sparking a lot of debate as to whether or not it had been shot down by the Air Force, or if the terrorists had simply kamikazed it into the ground, or if it was a completely unrelated tragedy. All the flights were grounded, of course, by this point.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, baby. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
Some of my friends out west were going frantic. They had heard what was going on, and since most of the flights, well, all of them, were selected because they were transcontinental, and therefore they had full tanks of gas, a lot of people on the West Coast were assuming that the West Coast was the target. A friend of mine was certain that one of the planes, which I guess had been bound for Portland, was intended to attack Portland because the guy who wrote the satanic verses was there at the time. This was nonsense, but there's a natural part of people that draws them to the center of any catastrophe. At the time, I found that annoying, but now I'm more sympathetic. We are all trying to make sense of awful things that happened. And tries to see how it relates to them, and I suppose how close they came to death.
No. Say you're gonna die. Live, say your prayers. We're gonna think positive because you gotta help each other get off the floor. Now,
I remember looking at the tower on the TV from a helicopter view or something, and one of the towers wobbled. It wobbled. Remember, this thing is as tall as an aircraft carrier is long, and it wobbled just slightly. And I said, it's coming down. My dad, who was an engineer, said, no, it's not. That can't happen. It'll burn out, but it can't fall down. But, of course, not long after that it did. Then there was a lot of hope and confusion and fear about the second tower. They had hoped that they might be able to save it, but soon the whole thing went down, as everybody knows. As I can recall, that one didn't even bother to wobble. There was so much smoke and dust kicked up by the first tower collapsing that we honestly couldn't tell if the second one was still there or not for a while. Then, when the smoke cleared some and we could see it, we really hoped it was going to stay up, just stabbing defiantly into the sky. That's an overdramatic way of saying it 20 years later. But at the time, we desperately hoped that something was going to remain. By this point, it was apparent that there weren't any other attacks coming. One of the local radio stations had started putting sound bites over a schmaltzy song that they played over the radio to, I don't know why radio stations did anything they did in those days, but there was a mad dash to see who could put out something commemorating the disaster, even as the disaster was still unfolding. Q105, a local radio station, picked a more or less forgotten, crappy song by Styx called Show Me the Way and put sound bites over the top of that. That played pretty constantly for a few weeks afterwards. Then either people recognized it for what it was, or perhaps they just remembered that it wasn't a very good song to begin with and it disappeared, and now seemingly nobody but me remembers it. Not that they should. We had a computer in the office, of course, and so we kept hopping on and off that, trying to get additional information. I remember trying to call my friend Paul, who lived in Brooklyn. Couldn't get through. All the phone lines were down. David Bowie later said that he was outside the city heading back when it happened, and he spent the entire day in his car snared in traffic, unable to contact his wife, unable to tell whether or not his wife and his kid were dead or alive. Just sitting there being terrified, watching the smoke come up from the burning city in the distance. I would like to say that I can't imagine what that must have been like, but the truth is, all of us can.
our number one is the staff, and our 5 is the staff.
Before the end of the day, the first conspiracy theories started. People were saying that Osama bin Laden wasn't real, that he was just a convenient boogeyman the government had invented, a sort of Emmanuel Goldstein from 1984. It had already been attributed to him, and of course he had already pulled off the attack on the USS Cole some years before. And there had been a previous terrorist attack, apparently unrelated to him, a few years earlier, I think in 1993, at the World Trade Center. Somebody pulled in a truck full of explosives and tried to blow it up from the parking garage, but that didn't work. And as I said, the conspiracy theories showed up. Some people were saying Osama bin Laden didn't do it. Some people were saying that it was an inside job. Again, the towers weren't even cold yet. This was showing up on the very first day, which, to be honest, I kind of bought into at the time. I mean, within a couple of weeks, I realized it was all nonsense, but I myself was struggling to make sense of it. I have since repudiated all of those theories, and I am more than a little bit embarrassed that I swallowed them for a while, and in fact, this is the first time I've ever admitted openly that they seemed plausible to me for a brief while. Unlike most people, I had a few insiders that I could contact for information, although it took me a while to get a hold of them. I had a buddy who was connected to some anti-terrorist stuff, one person in the government, a few people in New York. I had resources that most people didn't. That allowed me to clear the fog of unreason from my mind pretty quickly. But, my God. So anyway, we just stayed in the office for the rest of the day, and nobody at all came in after about 3:30. So I think my boss let us go home early. He said there was no reason to stay.
I just want you to know it's absolutely fuck you. I love you. Bye.
At this point, my memory fails me. I remember driving to my son's daycare and picking him up and putting him in the car seat and taking him home. He was about 3 at the time, and I asked him if he understood what had happened. He'd already heard about it. And he said some bad men flew a plane into a building and killed a lot of people. I said, yeah. However, I am informed that that didn't happen, that my son was actually at a different daycare at the time, one where my wife was temporarily working and she had kept an eye on him the whole time. I am completely willing to accept her version of events over mine. My memory is sketchy. I do remember losing my cool later on in the day. I remember yelling at her about something about how I was a little edgy, cut me a break because I just watched 30,000 people die on TV. And I remember thinking before I was even done saying the words that it was overdramatic and that I was using the tragedy for my own personal sense of grandiosity. It felt very unclean. I never did that again. Later on, we found that the numbers were far lower than we had anticipated. Someone pointed out the next day, or the day after that if the terrorists had simply skidded the thing into a clover leaf or a highway during rush hour, they would have taken out vastly more people and done far, far more damage. I have often wondered if we would remember that, or if we would remember it as singularly as we remember 9/11. The towers were a less effective target, but they were a far more iconic target than some nondescript stretch of superhighway outside of New York or DC or Philadelphia or whatever. I had nightmares for months after it happened of playing the old Microsoft Flight Simulator years and years and years before 9/11. It had this option where you could select various poorly rendered skylines of famous cities and fly over them, and of course one of them was New York. And of course the first thing virtually everyone did when flying out of New York was to smack into the towers. Deliberately. Just for laughs. And I kept seeing the first-person pilot's eye view of me hitting the poorly rendered building over and over and over, looped in my mind, in my dreams, and whenever I blinked my eyes. That sounds overdramatic, but it really made me edgy and put me to the point of mania on one or two instances. And I have often wondered how many other people had that same experience. So, that was my 9/11. That was the end of the old world. And now here we are.